You are listening to Fantha Tracks.
Because of the following special program, Wonder Woman and the Incredible Hulk will not be presented this evening.
It's time to get all your Star Wars news in a single file. This is Making Tracks. Here are your hosts, Mark Newbold and Mark Mulcaster.
It's not true. That's impossible.
Greetings, younglings, and welcome to Making Tracks Reaction Chat, brought to you by those fine lads and lasses over at fanfortracks.com. The penultimate part of Season 1 of Ahsoka has dropped, and with it, a lot of people's expectations that everything will be wrapped neatly by the end of next week's finale episode. But a brief recap, if your memory has been wiped, or if you were checking your phone during the viewing. I'm looking at you, Karen. So, a long time ago, in another galaxy far, far away. Oh, and by the way, this is your spoiler warning, so if you haven't seen this week's episode, go back and watch it. Our story has now transported us to a distant galaxy where Morgan Elsbeth hoped to find Grand Admiral Thrawn, and she has. Joining her on her quest is Baylan Skoll and his apprentice Shin Hati, who have other motives for journeying to the planet Peridia. Also in tow is Sabine Wren, who was their prisoner, only to be let free by Admiral Thrawn. As Thrawn starts to prepare for his departure back to the known galaxy, he dispatches Baylan and Shin to catch up with Sabine and take her out. Sabine completes the first part of her quest by being reunited with Ezra Bridger. You know, that annoying kid from Star Wars Rebels. Well, time's been good to him, and he's not so annoying anymore. In hot pursuit is Ahsoka, the White Tano, and Hu Yang, who is still killing time in the mouth of a Purgle space whale. But we start this week's episode back in the center of New Republic, with the Senate Oversight Committee hearing to decide on the fate of Hera Syndulla's command, only to be interrupted by someone with a message to deliver. So let's jump right in and start discussing this week's episode entitled Darkness and Madness with Making Tracks host Mark Newbold. And for once, I'm going to give my thoughts on this episode first. So Mark, that's me. What did you make of this week's episode? Well, Mark, that's a very interesting question. And to be honest, I quite liked it. It kind of felt like, an episode of Rebels. It felt almost slightly contained. I really liked the conversations and also the chemistry between Ezra and Sabine, and even Ahsoka and Hu Yang now. Everything seems to feel a little bit lighter. I'm still having trouble with how Thrawn is kind of coming over, but I really like the fact that we've now got to see him do some tactical strategies and stuff. And to be honest, it didn't feel like any different from watching a Star Wars Rebels episode. He was a couple of steps ahead of Ahsoka by setting all those minds up, which was an awesome sequence. Generally, I thought this is going in the right direction. However, it's whether or not you can actually get everything tied up for the end of the season next week, or whether or not this is just a precursor to the fact we're going to get a season 2 or even a film. So, Mr. Newbold, what did you make of it?
I think, and I agree, that it won't all wrap up next week. It kind of feels like we're at the end of Infinity War, when everything's kind of about to go really bad, and then you'll get the final episode when things go really bad. And then season 2 will be Endgame, when it all comes right. It kind of has that vibe. So I can't see it being resolved next week. They're not going to kill Thrawn off next week. He's going to be the big bad going forward, it feels like. To your point about it feeling like a Rebels episode, it really did. With Sabine and Ezra relationship was really well played. I love the way they fought together again. They had each other's backs back in the day in the show, which is 10 years old next year, ridiculously. And I know, and so reigniting that relationship now has been really fun to watch, and both actors playing it pitch perfect. So that's been great. Yeah. I also really like the preamble, the sort of the pre-Ahsoka logo moment with Hera being sort of dragged up in front of the Republic or New Republic Council, essentially, and being carpeted a little bit. That was well played, and a very, very cool cameo by C-3PO. So there was plenty of constituent parts that were really, really good. There's been people talking online saying, oh, it's a bit slow. And then a lot of conversation, and actually quite intelligent conversation, saying that the attitude of a lot of people now is if it's not an absolute belter of an episode, then it's filler or it's mid or whatever the stupid modern phrase for this kind of thing is. It's ridiculous. Every season has to have the ebb and flow. Everything can't be speeder bikes racing at 600 miles an hour through Endor Forest sort of thing. It's got to slow down a little bit. So I like the fact that this wasn't full pelt. But that being said, there was a little bit of everything in this. So, yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a thing, actually. When you look at it, we got a lot of action in this week's episode. There was a bit of standing around talking in the kind of classic Star Wars politicking kind of way at the start. But then, you had all that action with the Purgle. Probably the last half really was just pretty much some form of action, be it and a fantastic second duel between Ahsoka and Baylan Skoll, or like just the stuff with the Marauders. The Ahsoka is the one series so far that I think I've grappled with the most to really decide how I feel about it. And it's not because I don't like it. It's not like I'm kind of sat there kind of going, oh, this is dire. It feels like it's missing something, but it has everything in it. It has like a fantastic score by Kevin Kiner, and it has all these, I think, really echoes back to the original trilogy script. In every single episode, there's at least one or two, which I quite like. I mean, potentially they're a little bit on the nose for people who are really familiar with the original trilogy, such as ourselves. I haven't quite figured out what it is. I don't know if it's the fact that the whole time I feel like we're watching like I said, like last week, it's like a high fantasy element to Star Wars in this series. But also it feels like that the notion of this series is to kind of almost like kickstart the idea that actually there is myth and fables and storytelling in this galaxy. Because everything seems to be about, I thought this was myth, or like this was what they told us in Jedi Academy, even down to the fact like Ahsoka is now practicing listening to Anakin, which was a fantastic way to kind of shoehorn Hayden Christensen back in for another episode. Really liked that. Filoni and Favreau, they do it every single season. They will surprise us, so we can't discount everything or anything before next week's episode.
Yeah, I can't picture or visualize what that surprise will be. If Luke turned up, it would be very pleasant, for example, be very pleasant. And we now know that this is set after Mando season 3. They do mention Gideon. And so we kind of have a bit more of a placement of where
Context
this is set
and
when it's set. So that was helpful. I don't know where this is going to go next week, whether Thrawn gets back to our galaxy in that episode or whether we're left on a cliffhanger. I don't mind either way, to be honest. I'm all in anyway. So whatever comes next, I'm watching it.
Exactly.
Although whatever comes next, given that I know in the real world, the writer's strike at least is starting to come to a close. The actor's strike hasn't. So we're still a long way behind. No idea when a season 2 would come, even if they announced it at the end of the episode. I'm prepared to be surprised.
It's kind of almost like you said. I think people are, for wanting a better word, expecting every episode should end on a big cliffhanger, should end with a big reveal. And we kind of saw that pushback also a little bit with Andor. And I think this is a thing Ahsoka kind of seems to tread the two very distinct different ends of the Star Wars storytelling. So it kind of feels almost a little bit like Mando in terms of the amount of action we're getting week in, week out. But also it seems to be slow building in the same way that Andor's doing. So it's quite an interesting style placement for the series. That whole hearing Hera had, and I love that jacket. I like it that potentially that's like the equivalent of like dress uniform, because I always liked you saw like a hearing episode in Star Trek and they're wearing like dress uniforms and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, you could just kind of see just by watching it, you can just see how, at least with Senator Ziono, at least, that they're very blinkered, very myopic about even the possibility that the Empire could be kind of rallying together. Like, this is the irony. You've got him saying, oh, well, they're just separate warlords and stuff like that. But we know, having just seen that final episode of Mandalorian season 3, there's a whole shadow council. They're all talking to one another. They all have some kind of form of communication. So I guess some kind of form of agreement to work with each other. And yeah, obviously it's that kind of dramatic irony that these guys are so blinded. I feel like even though Mon Mothma is the Chancellor, it doesn't feel like that she's got much power, which is quite ironic compared to, you think, with the Empire, where the Emperor had all the power and the Senate was basically just a puppet Senate, really, just for show, and people feel a little bit better that their voices are being heard. This almost feels slightly the other way.
It makes me think of Andor, not only because you mentioned it, but because Mothma in that era it's all subterfuge. It's all under the table on the QT. You've got Luthen Rail, he's speaking to rebel agents who are, years deep into being Imperial ISB agents and all that kind of stuff that's going on. And now you come to this era and it feels like after Endor, and which got to mention, and Jakku, which didn't, weirdly, all that sort of subterfuge, all that politicking, certainly on the New Republic side, seems to have gone and stopped.
Yeah.
They're so trusting. They're so hopeful. That word that gets used too much in Star Wars. That hope has blinded them to the fact that we know we're seeing it from the other side. You mentioned the Shadow Council for Mando season 3. There's all of that going on, but it just also makes me think that they had mentioned, we saw it again in Mando. There's ex-Imperials being brought into the New Republic, working in various departments. So they're all trying to make it work. It's all trying to be fit together in this brave new galaxy. You can literally see it, certainly in that scene, how they're so blindly optimistic that, oh, nothing's going to hurt us. Who's going to attack us now? It's
exactly.
and you know it's coming.
Yeah, exactly. That's I guess the dramatic irony about it all is that we know that it's coming, and I think completely going back to what we said earlier on, the idea that Thrawn's getting out of his galaxy into our known galaxy, as it were. I think that's probably got to be where the next episode ends. Or maybe not. Whatever he's kind of loading, they're almost completely loaded. So it could.
Well, I think if Thrawn is
part of the episode.
Yeah, I think Thrawn is playing it really cool by saying our numbers are depleted and we haven't got the resources that we used to have. I don't believe a word of it. I'm fully expecting the Chimera to jump out of that hyperspace ring next week with 30 Star Destroyers behind it over Coruscant. Something big. I don't quite believe him. I think he's playing close to his chest.
Yeah, I mean, that, to be honest, that is the kind of thing that we've never really had. We've never seen anybody get to Coruscant really since the Clone Wars. It's something that they talked about, and we saw it in Legends with like the expanded universe and that.
What, the Vong and all that?
With the Vong, but also the Rebels taking of Coruscant. But we've not seen that in live action. You can imagine, because I'm just remembering back in Dark Force Rising, Last Command. I think it was in Dark Force Rising, and then it was resolved in Last Command. Basically, Thrawn had all these cloaking shields that he put on asteroids, which he towed them into the atmosphere, or just the higher atmosphere of Coruscant, which meant that nobody could go in and out because they couldn't see where these asteroids were. And so he basically had Coruscant laid to siege. Something not necessarily quite as convoluted as that, but you could imagine if you're going to make a big impact, because they've really focused on Senator Ziona. I know they had a couple of other senators in that first holocall that they had between the senators and Hera, but it seems to be Senator Ziona seems to be kind of like the key focus to this lack of belief that there's an empire out there. So I'd love to see like that smug look get wiped off his face as like the Chimera drops a load of turbo lasers right on his face.
I'm Anthony Daniels, and you are listening to Fantha Tracks. Well done.
We could probably say, I think, Hera wasn't particularly winning the argument in the hearing, and then we kind of have a Deus Ex Machina, quite literally, of C-3PO turning up to deliver a message from Leia Organa, which was cool in itself. But the one thing it led me to think was, if they're going to try and keep Leia Organa in play in this time period, whether or not it starts to going to be a little bit convoluted, how many times they can kind of mention her and have her influence off screen before we really need to see her in the flesh, as it were. So whether or not that is a CGI version or whether or not it's a recast. But I was really happy to see 3PO, but I think I was also a little bit bummed that it wasn't Leia standing there.
Yeah, I think now we've got to that point where, we know the tech can do amazing things with de-aging and stuff. There is no actress to de-age to play Leia at the age that she would be, because essentially I think Leia would be, 5 years after Jedi, so
40?
20... No, nowhere near that. No. She was born 20 years before A New Hope, so she'd be 27, 28, maybe. She's not even 30 at this point, Leia, as a character.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So I think you're probably at a point where you've got to open it up. You can't have the same actors play the same roles forever and a day if you want to tell this massive, expansive and interweaving story. And people have just got to get used to the fact that Alden Ehrenreich doesn't look exactly like Harrison Ford, but he's Han Solo. So I think they could, and it's probably a good time to either say to Billy Lord, hey, do you want to be Leia? Or find another actress who can really embody that role and take it forward, in the same way that Vivian's doing it as a younger performance of Leia, for example.
That's you're in is that they've already technically recast Leia, albeit as like a 11-year-old. So that's kind of been done because they've had to. And really, if you want to have Senator Leia Organa in live action, you're going to have to do it. It's a big call to make, regardless. But I think for the purpose of story, which is really what should really be the main motivated behind this. I think it's something that they should possibly think about doing.
And especially if they are doing a Lando film, let's say, and they do bring Alden back, Donald's playing Lando, and there's your recasts right there. And they were great. So let's use them again. So if you bring in an actress that's age appropriate to play Leia at this point of time, you've got all those characters you can use as much as you want. And the same for Luke. We've had Hamill come back as a de-aged Luke, but that's not sustainable on
I don't think so. Not
ongoing
on a TV budget, really.
No.
Not. I mean, other than like the occasional episode, which, to be honest, I suppose not necessarily is a bad thing. I mean, it all depends upon how much we want to see Luke in this time period. Which I, for one, want to see. I want to see a lot more of Luke. Again, I feel it's obviously from a convenience standpoint that they kind of tucked him away on that planet to kind of build his own academy. But that there is a story. That there is a film or a trilogy or even like a live action TV series. And I think that's the thing. It's something that people will have to get used to. The space whales. It kind of feels like there must have been a certain amount of time has passed between last week's episode and this week's episode, because it does take a little while to mine a whole system with space mines.
Yeah, I mean, that was an impressive sequence just to see that all laid out, very Galaxy Quest, to see all those mines waiting above the planet like that. And when the whales come out, the whole sequence leading up to that was great. Yang was just being his typical, and let's hope we see more of him in other stuff, because he's old enough to be in everything. Him and Ahsoka, their relationship, as you mentioned, is great fun. She's lightened up. Since she had that sort of moment, if you want to call that, with Anakin, it kind of flicked a switch. So to see that sequence inside the Purrgil as they're dropping out of hyperspace, and then bang, 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 here we go, straight into the mines. I did expect it to be a fleet of Star Destroyers sitting there. I really did. The way that Thrawn was talking last week, deal with them with extreme prejudice. If you see a star whale, take it out. But the mines idea made great sense. It was a little bit like throwing a hand grenade at the Empire State Building with those things flying through it. But nevertheless, it spooked them enough that he spewed the ship out and they jumped, didn't they? Yeah.
But they're kind of like, I think they're like swarm mines, aren't they? They kind of like, they seem to be attracted to a space body, be it a ship or the Purrgils and stuff. And I think this is riffing off an idea that they had, I think, even going way back to the Marvel comics, like, which is cool, and I think we've also seen something similar maybe in Star Wars Rebels. I could be wrong. It's very familiar. It might have been a Star Trek thing, if I'm honest. I don't know. But that kind of thing is very, it's kind of like a tropey kind of aspect to the mines, but it was a great way of getting them out onto the planet. Also having that whole little kind of moment where they're hiding and they have got to power down and stuff, which is stuff we've seen a couple of times in different trilogies over the years. So that was quite cool.
But never in a debris field around a planet that was essentially was water, wasn't it? They were underwater. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, it was really bizarre because I was looking at it and I was going, you can see like these little fishies.
Because it was like a graveyard, wasn't it? It was like a Purrgil graveyard. You could see all the bones and the detritus, and it sort of made its own little environment. Yeah,
which is what I believe the Grand Night Mothers, or whatever the hell they're called, I think last week or something, said that like there's basically this graveyard, which in itself is quite an interesting thing. So that's sort of clearly where they started to kind of connect the dots that these whales come in from another galaxy or something, or another place via their hyperspace and to go and die. So maybe they don't just die there. Maybe they mate there or what have you.
For everything in one location, daily news, reviews, interviews, podcasts, video, and social media feeds, bookmark FanthaTracks.com for Star Wars news 24/7, 365.
A lot of the talk about the planet, it feels anyway on the surface, it's very mundane. It's very drab looking planet, like almost a dead planet, like, or something that's just clinging on to life. There's not a huge abundance of life on there other than the Notri and however many Night Sisters are there, but it kind of almost feels like there's probably not many really, if any of those Night Mothers are even all fully alive still. They might be dead and reanimated for all we know.
It'd be interesting to see, though, on that point, that the planet itself, not that I think we'll get too far out into the weeds because we've got a whole other galaxy that needs exploring and stories telling about that. But I just wonder, given that the Dathomiri originated from this other galaxy and came across, presumably with the Purrgils, and came to this galaxy that we've known for 40-odd years, there's been a whole history and legends of that place. Societies have risen and fallen. And, to your observation, it looks like there's stuff has happened there before. There's not much happening there now. Probably why Thrawn decided to go there as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is it. It's whether or not he did, because if
That's where the whales took him.
that's basically where the whales took him, and it just happened to be that happy convenience of Star Wars that it happens to be where the Night Sisters are. I don't know, because obviously the fact that Ezra Bridger is still there, there's a lot of untold stories and adventures that we could have there. It's like, how did he get off of the Chimera? Did he cause any damage beyond taking Thrawn to the other side of the galaxy? Did he kill a load of stormtroopers? And he's developed his kind of force abilities, and he's been able to develop his force abilities without even a lightsaber. Sabine offers him the lightsaber, and he's like, no, I've got my hands. It's all good. Gives him all a little force shove and stuff. So he's clearly been still training by himself. To what capacity, I don't know. It felt genuine. It felt conversations that they had beyond the slightly awkwardness of Sabine consent. It's kind of complicated. And it's like, if ever there's a time to spin an uncomplicated yarn, it's whilst you're traveling miles with nothing else to do. But the actual pitter-patter and the back and forth that they had throughout this whole episode, I thought was really cool. I was kind of hoping to have a little bit more conflict. I think she kind of almost has to, at some point, admit what she's done, because I feel like there has to be some penalty for giving Thrawn the way back into the known galaxy.
Yeah, that's going to be, like you say, when that does come out, because she has been a little bit evasive. They are just bimbling along at their own speed with the Noti. They're not in any great rush. They seem to know where they're going. They're a nomadic sort of race anyway, by the looks of it. The way they trundled in that little caravan was very cool. Didn't expect them vehicles to have such speed though. When they started to be chased down, they really got motoring. So we love that. But yeah, I'm sure Ezra's, he's a smart guy, and he's older. He's not as impatient as he used to be. Clearly, there's that nice brotherly, sisterly banter between the two of them. So he's biding his time. He's waited long enough. So I suppose he'll find out in all good time. But yeah, she's definitely being kind of evasive, doesn't really want to say. Because when we get to the real sharp end of it next week, if ever he finds out, you did what to save me?
Exactly. If there's any kind of actual like face-to-face confrontation with Thrawn will say that, because that will immediately destabilize any kind of like a harmony that they've got. That's how he creates a conflict between Sabine and Ezra if he needs to kind of put them on steady ground and that. It's a bit like what's kind of going on like with Baylan and Shin, and that's one that's really interesting. It feels like Baylan is at the start of a quest that I don't think we're going to see the end of.
Baylan really seems unbalanced, not happy. Every time you look at him, he seems uncertain. He's more than competent and more than confident, but in these moments, when he has that one-on-one with Ahsoka, and they're both going for it, and there's a little score to settle for her, and she does get the better of him. She could have ended it there and then, but she doesn't.
Yeah, totally.
But there's just that whole tone of him that he's not sure. And of course, we know Shin is now unsure of him because there's doubt coming in her sort of whole demeanor as well. So the two of them are really imbalanced, and they do feel, when you look up the sort of ladder at Thrawn and his bigger plan, which is still sort of unfolding to us, that they're just, he didn't even know they were coming with Morgan Elsbeth the other week. So they're barely, on his radar. So they're not really part of his plan. They're a means to an end.
Although, except for like when is in that classic kind of Star Wars Rebels Thrawn kind of way, when the Imperial's on the back foot and retreating, he kind of basically blames Baylan Skoll for not being present. He kind of says, doesn't he, like, oh, well, because Baylan Skoll's not there, as if he was kind of counting on him. It's like, dude, you didn't know the dude was turning up. You kind of sent him out on a chase, like last week's episode. And I really need to re-listen to what he says. One, I really like give me all the information that you can about Ahsoka, and they get it from the Inquisitorius database. I thought that was really cool. That was a nice kind of like little link, because you kind of think, well, has everyone, like every Jedi, got a record? Like the Russians used to kind of keep these kind of records, and everybody, like, and they call it, I think it was Ibisca or something, like, and literally it would be like for a whole record of your life, every time you got in trouble with anybody or where you went, all your stuff like that, and all your grades and stuff. And yet
Thrawn seems to have forgotten that he knows Ahsoka is Anakin's Padawan.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know whether that's him playing games, or it's a slightly been overlooked by the writers, or what that is. A lot of people have picked up on that.
From the new Thrawn books Timothy Zahn put out and stuff, like, he spent a lot of time with Anakin Skywalker, to the point whereby he kind of figures out that Vader is Anakin. So it kind of seems he should be more clued up on it. But then he makes this weird kind of statement, which even I didn't really pay attention to. But he kind of basically says, oh, we're going to just like let Ahsoka make her own decision because that's basically what we want her to do. And therefore she's going to fall into all our plans. And it's kind of like, it just made, I listened to it and went, you're kind of talking a little bit out of your arse. That didn't, I mean, maybe I need to go and rewatch it and it will make more sense. That just kind of sounds like you don't quite know what you're talking and now you're just feeling like you've got to talk to kind of reassure this woman who stood in front of you and stuff.
But don't you think with Thrawn sometimes, even though he's the master manipulator, always 2 steps ahead, all the things we know about him as a character from books and comics and Rebels and such, that Ahsoka turning up was probably not expected.
Correct. Yep.
Baylan thinks he's finished her, and Sabine thinks she's dead. So her turning up as Ahsoka the White is not what they're expecting. But with Thrawn, and it may not always be the case, and there's probably other levels of stuff going on that we don't pick up on or don't quite clock, but it just feels like sometimes he talks to make it sound like everything's in hand and I've got a plan, and and that kind of does come across as one of those sort of I need to say something. I can't just leave this awkward silence. I've got to say something. Don't worry, Lady Night Sisters, I have a plan or whatever. So there does seem to be a little bit of that.
For me to kind of feel like we're getting some real kind of weight on the character. He needs to win. He needs to have a big decisive victory. And I don't necessarily just mean make it back into the known galaxy. I think he needs to do something in there pretty sharpish, because I guess, and it's potentially, it could be on the cards, if they just decide to drop the season 2 and go straight into the film, how does this all work? Because then suddenly it's like you've just had a TV show where you've had to pretty much watch 2 other TV shows to get the story. Now you're going to have a feature film where you're going to potentially need to see at least one series, if not 2 other TV series, to kind of get what's going on. So it kind of like starts to limit the market a little bit. But by the end of this series, or at least very early on in season 2, if they do it, then he needs to be really on top. And maybe there's a big time jump. Maybe that's it. We see him get into the galaxy, and the next time we see it is a galaxy is in absolute chaos. It's upside down because Thrawn's come in and just ripped all the way through it, which would be cool.
It would be, or alternatively, he could go completely the opposite way to what we think, and he may come back to our galaxy and go straight back to the unknown regions and not make any big attack and regroup and bide. It's not like he hasn't had to take his time as it is. He's clearly been busy with those night troopers and his association with the Night Sisters and all the other stuff that's going on. So maybe our assumption is he's going to come in and attack and lead the remnant. Maybe by Mando season 4, maybe the Shadow Council's reunited and it's not Gideon in the middle, it's Thrawn in the middle and Pelian's there. And
I think it's going to depend upon like how long a game they want to play it. Really, how long do you want to build it up as a big bad? In next week's episode, he's got this cargo. So really what he needs to do is get into the other galaxy and then drop off those. They're going to go back to Dathomir, potentially, I guess. I don't know. But that would be my logic, would be like, oh, we're going to drop you off at Dathomir. And actually the big bad, as it were, or the big threat isn't so much Thrawn. He's going to be a pain. Like you said, he's going to go off and regroup and formulate a stronger empire and galvanize that. But actually the immediate threat might actually be the Night Sisters and whatever's in those kind of caskets.
Well, that's true. I mean, and where would they want to take that army? Where would they want to go? Would they want to consolidate on Dathomir? Is that even an option at this point in time? I don't know the status of Dathomir at this point, but, or have they got a specific targeted plan? And Thrawn doesn't feel like the kind of guy that needs a council. Enoch's there. We don't know the level of association between the two. He's captain of his guard, but is he a confidant? Has Thrawn got a confidant at this point? Did he ever really have one?
Well, I don't think he did. I mean, like, even in the expanded universe, you had Pelion, but he was more of a subordinate and very much...
He was loyal, wasn't he? Yeah.
He was loyal and very much kind of learning from Thrawn. Everything was like, pay attention, Captain. You see, we're going to do this. And it's criticism I've heard and seen a lot about this series is that there seems to be, and I guess, again, it comes back to what we started talking about. It's like, do you need instant gratification for this stuff? But it seems to be like, you could almost say, a lot of mystery box components to a series. And it feels like every time we get something answered, we have 4 or 5 more questions, which in some respects isn't a bad thing. But as long as they get answered, I don't like Ahsoka and then like the Mandalorian to basically turn into the next generation version of Lost. Where
Yes, literally what I was thinking.
Where everything's, they're asking all these questions because that's what's interesting. That's what's keeping people talking about Star Wars and the speculation. But then when it comes time to wrap it up, it's just like a bit of a damp fart. And everybody's like, oh, well, we knew that from the first season anyway. So
yeah, and also because it's the Mandoverse, we know there's not going to be a spin-off novel, and we know there's not going to be a spin-off comic, or there won't be that ancillary stuff that, for example, Andor may well get, or other stories might get. Well, the
sequel trilogy kind of got, with the journeys of books and stuff like that, which in itself is quite interesting. I suppose, like, they seem to be quite happy to kind of channel all their High Republic books and that to keep the Star Wars book line afloat, as it were. So yeah. And actually enjoyed at points the Chuck Wendig series and all those Journey to the Force Awakens, Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker. They offered very little in the way of anything beyond like an interesting story. Like anybody who went into and I think everybody went into Aftermath expecting to learn loads about where we're going to be set in The Force Awakens, was, I think, disappointed by that. I guess at this point, they're savvy enough to kind of, why would we want to then, even if it's a small restriction, suddenly find out we can't use a character in a certain way because of this book? I know they want to be loyal to the canon, as it were, but I think it's that whole George Lucas level of respect to the canon, which is basically respect to the canon from his films and his TV shows rather than everything else. Because you would have thought Battle of Jakku, even if it's just a tiny little mention at some point, would be kind of cool, just to feel like we're still moving towards that sequel trilogy. So, okay, is there one prediction for next week's episode, or do you reckon it's still so wide open that it's not worth doing?
Yeah, well, we're often wrong.
We're always wrong, yeah.
It's very up in the air. I think it's very up in the air. I think Hera has to come in and have not that she needs it in our eyes, but in maybe the Republic Council's eyes, a sort of a moment of redemption. Because even when Mothma's talking to Hera and Mothma's like, she saw straight through what was happening there.
Oh, yeah.
In a moment. And she kind of dug it because that's politics. But, Hera needs a win, I think, in that sense. So, and that's why I think it could go either way. It could be that Thrawn comes back but doesn't make a big song and dance. But as a television show and a fandom expecting, the next Battle of Endor, I think they'd be disappointed. So I think there probably will be something quite explosive in that sense. But I think next week, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they really went big and gave us massively. I don't know how, I don't know what, I don't know whether there'll be a character sacrifice. I would kind of like that. I don't know whether there'll be a Rebels reunion. Lots of elements that could pull together.
Did Zeb get a mention? He did, didn't he, in this week's episode? I think I think Sabine did that very quick, and there's no Empire because Endor, and Hera's doing this. She's a general, and that's his Zeb's. I think he's like training pilots. So potentially, why not? We want a body.
But who?
The safe bet would probably be either Baylan or Shin. Probably Baylan. And then Shin, kind of, as I think we kind of speculated at the beginning, kind of basically throws a lot in with Ahsoka. I kind of get the set, like him kind of turning her back on her. I think he was doing it partly as a training exercise, but also I think he's kind of realized that her mindset is all about power and influence and not the kind of power that he's after. But this is obviously the thing with Ray Stevenson no longer in existence, unfortunately. Whether or not there is a satisfying ending to the Baylan Skull character, or whether or not actually, they go, well, okay, Ray was great, but we set this character up to do something, to be something. Let's fulfill that. And maybe they do a recast between season 1 and season 2, and we just accept that. Somebody gave me a really left field fan theory the other day. Basically, he said, what if all those things in the caskets, everybody's assuming that they're dead Night Sisters of some description or other. What if they're like reanimated and they are the Sith in Exegol, all the shrouded ones in black, Sith Eternal.
Sith Eternal.
Well, I didn't see that coming. I don't really have a prediction. I think we'll be back in our galaxy, as it were, and then there will be maybe some kind of reveal.
If you want to be part of the action, visit fanthatracks.com or be sure to comment, like and share on our social media feeds at Fanthatracks. Send in your listeners' questions by emailing radio@fantatrax.com. Subscribe, leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on Amazon Music, Audible, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcatcher or smart speaker of choice. And as always, thanks to James Semple for composing the Fantatrax intro, Adam O'Brien for our Making Tracks opening music, and Mark Daniel and Vanessa Marshall for our voiceovers. Tune in to Good Morning Tatooine. It's live Sunday evenings, 9 o'clock UK, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific, on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. And check out our Fantatrax Radio Friday night rotation every Friday at 7 o'clock UK time for new episodes of The Phantom from Down Under, Planet Leia, Desert Planet Discs, Start Your Engines, Collecting Tracks, Canon Fodder, and special episodes of Making Tracks, and every Tuesday at 7 o'clock UK time for your weekly episode of Making Tracks. And remember, Fantatrax.com, our social media feeds, Fantatrax TV and Fantatrax Radio are absolutely free. So no Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, Kickstarter or Indiegogo required to stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news.
So I think we shall probably park this episode and discussion here. So thank you very much for listening. We will be back next week, hopefully, for a very long-winded discussion about Ahsoka final episode. Can't wait. So until then, stay safe, take care, may the Force be with you.
Coming up next on Fantatrax Radio, it's another episode of Making Tracks.